The gymnasium fell silent as Maria Gonzalez stepped onto the polished floor. 3,000 people packed the bleachers, their voices creating a wall of sound that bounced off the concrete walls. Basketball games at Central High always drew crowds, but tonight felt different. The air crackled with tension that had nothing to do with the upcoming match. Maria smoothed her referee uniform and checked her whistle. 23 years she had been officiating games in this district. 23 years of broken-up fights, mediating disputes, and keeping young athletes focused on the sport they loved. Her reputation preceded her, fair but firm, respected by players and coaches alike. The visiting team from Riverside High warmed up on the far end of the court. Their coach, Derek Hammond, paced the sideline like a caged animal. His reputation preceded him too, but for different reasons. Known for his explosive temper and history of pushing boundaries, Hammond had been warned multiple times by the district about his behavior toward officials. Maria had worked his games before. She knew his patterns: the gradual escalation, the testing of limits, the way he worked a crowd into a frenzy when calls went against his team. Tonight, she sensed something different in his demeanor. More aggressive. More personal. The home team, Central High Eagles, took their positions. Their young coach, Sarah Chen, gave Maria a respectful nod. At 28, Chen was one of the youngest head coaches in the district, but she had earned respect through her players' discipline and sportsmanship. Her teams played hard but clean. As game time approached, Maria gathered the other officials, two men she had worked with for years. Tom Bradley, a retired police officer who brought steady calm to heated moments. Jim Morrison, a high school teacher who understood teenage emotions better than most. They discussed the game ahead, noting the rivalry between the schools and Hammond's recent technical fouls in other games. The opening tip went to Central High. The gymnasium erupted as the home team scored first. Maria positioned herself perfectly, calling the game with her usual precision. The first quarter passed without incident, both teams playing inspired basketball. But, as the second quarter began, the tide shifted. Riverside High took the lead, and Hammond's voice grew louder from the sideline. He questioned every call, his complaints becoming more personal and pointed. Maria issued a quiet warning, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated. The crowd sensed the growing tension. Parents from both sides began shouting, their voices mixing into a chaotic symphony of disagreement. Maria had seen this before: how quickly a sporting event could transform into something uglier, especially when authority figures lost control of their emotions. With 5 minutes left in the first half, Maria called a foul on Riverside's star player. It was a clear violation, an intentional elbow to an opponent's ribs. But Hammond exploded from the sideline, screaming that she was biasing the game. His face turned red as he stormed toward center court. Maria held her ground. She had faced aggressive coaches before, but something in Hammond's eyes told her this confrontation would be different. The gymnasium grew quieter, sensing the dramatic moment building. Even the players stopped their warm-ups to watch. Hammond got within inches of her face, his voice carrying across the now silent court. The words he used were not just about basketball. They were personal attacks on her competence, her integrity, and, worse. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some people beginning to realize they were witnessing something beyond normal sports conflict. Maria raised her hand, signaling a technical foul. This only inflamed Hammond further. He began gesturing wildly, his voice growing even louder. She gave him a second technical, which should have ejected him from the game. But Hammond did not leave the court. Instead, he stepped closer. The 3,000 witnesses held their breath as they watched a man twice her size tower over the small-framed referee. Maria stood her ground, but those closest to the action could see her hands trembling slightly. What happened next shocked everyone in the building. In full view of players, coaches, parents, and students, Derek Hammond drew back his right hand and struck Maria Gonzalez across the face. The sound echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot. The crowd gasped collectively. Some people screamed. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A high school basketball game had just become something much more serious, a public assault captured by dozens of cell phone cameras. Maria stumbled backward but did not fall. Her hand went to her cheek where a red mark was already forming. Hammond stood there for a moment, seeming to realize what he had done. Then, as security guards finally reached the court, he began shouting that she had deserved it, that she had been asking for it all season. The other officials immediately surrounded Maria, while security escorted Hammond from the building. The game was suspended indefinitely. Parents began filing out, many of them still in shock at what they had witnessed. The players from both teams stood frozen, unsure how to process what they had seen. But Maria Gonzalez remained on the court. Even as the gymnasium emptied, even as paramedics arrived to check on her, she stood in the center of that court with a dignity that impressed everyone who saw her. She declined medical attention, stating she was fine. She collected her equipment methodically, as if this were just another game ending. A reporter who had been covering the game approached her for comment. Maria looked directly into the camera and spoke calmly, "This is not about me. This is about every official, every woman, every person who has been told they deserved violence because someone disagreed with their decisions. What happened here tonight will not be ignored." Those words would prove prophetic. Within hours, video footage of the incident had spread across social media. Local news stations picked up the story. By morning, it had reached national outlets. The image of a middle-aged woman standing her ground after being publicly struck by a man twice her size resonated with people far beyond the sports world. District officials immediately suspended Hammond pending investigation. The school board called emergency meetings. Parents demanded answers about how such violence could occur at a high school sporting event. The basketball season was temporarily halted while policies were reviewed. But Maria Gonzalez said little in those first days after the incident. She filed a police report, as was required. She met with district officials and provided her statement. Then, she went home to her family and began planning something that would surprise everyone who thought they knew her. Those closest to Maria knew she was not someone who acted impulsively. Every decision she made was carefully considered, thoroughly researched, and strategically planned. Her friends wondered why she seemed so calm in the days following the assault. Her family worried that she was suppressing her emotions. The truth was that Maria had been preparing for a moment like this her entire career. Not specifically to be struck by an angry coach, but to face a situation that tested everything she believed about justice, dignity, and the power of patience. She had watched too many incidents get swept under the rug, too many victims told to move on quietly, too many perpetrators face minimal consequences. This time would be different. This time, 3,000 people had witnessed what happened. This time, the evidence was undeniable. And, this time, Maria Gonzalez had a plan that would transform not just her own situation, but the entire culture of high school athletics in the district. As the first week passed, Hammond's supporters began organizing. They claimed he was a good man who had simply lost his temper. They pointed to his championship record and community involvement. Some even suggested that Maria had provoked the incident through her officiating style. But Maria remained silent, working quietly behind the scenes. She was consulting with attorneys, reviewing policies, and building a case that would address not just what had happened to her, but the systemic issues that had allowed it to happen. She understood that true change required more than just punishing one individual. The media attention continued to grow. Sports commentators debated the incident on television. Social media buzzed with opinions from people who had never heard of Central High before. Some supported Hammond, others condemned him, but everyone seemed to have an opinion about what should happen next. Through it all, Maria maintained her composure. She returned to work, officiating games at other schools while Hammond's case worked its way through the system. She gave no interviews beyond her initial statement. She appeared to be moving on with her life as if nothing had happened. This puzzled many people. They expected anger, demands for immediate action, or at least public statements about the injustice she had suffered. Instead, Maria Gonzalez seemed to be waiting for something. Those who knew her best understood that this patience was not weakness or resignation. It was strategy. As the weeks passed and the initial media frenzy died down, people began to assume the incident would fade into memory like so many other sports controversies. Hammond's supporters grew more vocal, claiming the punishment had already exceeded the crime. Some district officials hinted that they wanted to put the matter behind them and focus on the remainder of the basketball season. But Maria was far from finished. She was building something much larger than anyone imagined, something that would demonstrate the true power that comes from patience, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The strike that 3,000 people had witnessed was only the beginning of a story that would reshape everything they thought they knew about accountability and consequence. What she did next would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to violence is not immediate retaliation, but the patient construction of something that ensures such violence can never happen again. The real demonstration of her power was still to come. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at Central High, and Maria Gonzalez had become a mystery to everyone watching her case. While the local newspapers continued running stories about the assault, while parents debated the issue at PTA meetings, while Hammond's lawyers prepared his defense, Maria remained remarkably quiet. This silence was strategic, though few people understood it at the time. Maria had learned long ago that in a world where everyone rushed to judgment, where social media demanded immediate reactions, the person who waited and observed often held the most power. She was watching, learning, and building something that would outlast any emotional outburst. Her days followed a careful routine. She arrived at her office job at the insurance company by 8 each morning, processed claims with her usual efficiency, and left at exactly 5 o'clock. Co-workers who expected her to be consumed by the legal proceedings were surprised by her apparent normalcy. She ate lunch at her desk, answered emails promptly, and showed no signs of the trauma that everyone assumed she must be experiencing. But Maria's evenings told a different story. After dinner with her family, she retreated to her home office and worked on something that no one else knew about. Legal documents, policy manuals, correspondence with officials from other school districts, research into similar incidents across the country. She was building a comprehensive understanding of how situations like hers were typically handled, and, more importantly, why they usually failed to create lasting change. The phone calls came constantly during those first weeks. Reporters wanted interviews. Victim advocacy groups offered support. Other officials shared their own stories of abuse from coaches and spectators. Maria listened politely to all of them, took careful notes, but declined most requests for public comment. This frustrated many people who wanted her to be more vocal about her experience. Her lawyer, Patricia Santos, was equally puzzled by her client's approach. Santos had handled dozens of assault cases and was accustomed to victims who wanted immediate justice, maximum publicity, and the largest possible settlement. Maria fit none of these patterns. She asked detailed questions about legal procedures, requested copies of all documents, and insisted on understanding every aspect of the case before making any decisions. During their third meeting, Santos finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "Maria, I have to be honest with you. Most clients in your situation want to see immediate consequences. They want the perpetrator punished as quickly and severely as possible. You seem almost detached from the emotional aspects of this case. Are you sure you're processing what happened to you?" Maria smiled for the first time since the incident. "Patricia, I've been processing what happened to me for 23 years. Every time a coach screamed at me, every time a parent questioned my integrity, every time someone suggested that officiating was too stressful for a woman. What happened that night was just the culmination of a pattern I've been observing my entire career." She opened a thick folder on Santos's desk. Inside were newspaper clippings, incident reports, and documentation from dozens of similar cases across the state. This happens more often than people realize. Officials are verbally abused, threatened, and sometimes physically assaulted. Most of the time, the perpetrators receive minimal punishment and return to coaching within a season or two. The victims are often encouraged to accept settlements and sign non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from speaking about their experiences. Santos examined the documents with growing amazement. Maria had compiled a comprehensive database of athletic-related assaults going back 5 years. She had tracked patterns in how these cases were resolved, identified weaknesses in current policies, and documented the long-term consequences for both victims and the sports programs involved. I don't want Derek Hammond to receive a slap on the wrist and return to coaching next year, Maria continued. I want to create a system that prevents other officials from experiencing what I experienced. That's going to require more than just winning a lawsuit. It's going to require changing how these situations are handled at every level. While Maria worked quietly on her comprehensive approach, Hammond's situation was deteriorating in ways he had not anticipated. The initial support from some parents and community members began to waver as more details emerged about his history. Records requests revealed that he had been warned about his behavior toward officials multiple times over the past 3 years. There had been complaints from other schools, incident reports filed with the district, and at least 2 previous occasions where he had to be restrained during heated arguments with referees. His employer, a local construction company, placed him on administrative leave after the video went viral. Several major clients expressed concern about being associated with someone who had struck a woman in public. The company's insurance rates increased due to the negative publicity. Hammond, who had built his identity around being a successful coach and businessman, found both pillars of his life crumbling simultaneously. His wife, Jennifer, struggled with the public attention and the questions from their children's friends at school. She had known about Derek's temper, had seen how basketball consumed him during the season, but she had never imagined he would cross the line into physical violence. The video footage made denial impossible, and she found herself having to defend a man whose behavior she could not understand or excuse. The players on Hammond's team were caught in an impossible situation. Many of them respected him as a coach and had been planning to play college basketball with his assistance in recruiting. But the suspension left them without leadership during the most important part of their season. Some transferred to other schools, others quit the team entirely, and a few tried to maintain loyalty while privately questioning everything they thought they knew about their coach. Meanwhile, the broader community began examining its own relationship with competitive sports. Parents who had cheered Hammond's aggressive coaching style now wondered if they had been enabling toxic behavior. School board members reviewed policies that had been ignored or inadequately enforced. The incident became a catalyst for conversations that had been avoided for years. Maria observed all of these developments with careful attention. She read every newspaper article, watched every news broadcast, and monitored social media discussions about the case. She was particularly interested in the reactions from other school districts, noting which ones implemented policy changes and which ones insisted that such incidents were isolated problems that did not require systematic solutions. Her research revealed patterns that disturbed her. In most cases, assaults on officials resulted in temporary suspensions that were lifted once public attention moved on to other stories. Coaches who had struck referees often returned to different schools within a year or two. The officials who were assaulted frequently left their positions, either from trauma or from frustration with inadequate support from administrators. This cycle perpetuated a culture where aggressive behavior toward officials was tolerated as long as it did not cross certain lines. But those lines were poorly defined and inconsistently enforced. Maria realized that challenging Hammond alone would do nothing to address the systemic issues that had allowed the incident to occur in the first place. She began reaching out to officials in other districts, sharing her research and asking about their experiences. The responses were both validating and heartbreaking. Nearly every official had stories of verbal abuse, intimidation, and threats. Many had considered quitting after particularly ugly incidents. Several had been physically threatened or assaulted but had been discouraged from filing formal complaints by administrators who worried about negative publicity for their programs. One veteran official in a neighboring district told her, "Maria, what happened to you happens to someone every season. The only difference is that yours was captured on video with 3,000 witnesses. Most of the time, we're told to be tougher, to let it roll off our backs, to understand that emotions run high in competitive sports. We're made to feel like the problem is our sensitivity rather than their behavior." These conversations reinforced Maria's conviction that individual justice was not enough. She needed to create a framework that would protect future officials and establish clear consequences for anyone who crossed the line into abuse or violence. This would require more than just legal action against Hammond. It would require policy changes, cultural shifts, and sustained pressure on administrators who had been content to ignore the problem. As the fourth week after the incident began, Maria finally scheduled a meeting with district officials. They expected her to discuss settlement terms or express concerns about returning to work. Instead, she arrived with a detailed proposal for comprehensive reform of how athletic-related conflicts were handled. The proposal included mandatory anger management training for all coaches, clear escalation procedures for dealing with abusive behavior, and significant financial penalties for programs that failed to control their personnel. It established victim support systems and required transparency in how complaints were investigated and resolved. Most importantly, it created a database that would track problematic behavior across districts, preventing coaches from simply moving to new schools after serious incidents. District Superintendent Robert Hayes read through the proposal with growing amazement. "Maria, this is incredibly comprehensive. You've obviously put enormous effort into this. But implementing these changes would require cooperation from multiple districts, changes to state athletic association policies, and significant budget allocations. This goes far beyond resolving your individual case." Maria nodded calmly. "Mr. Hayes, my individual case is just one example of a problem that affects every official in this state. Derek Hammond struck me because he believed there would be no serious consequences for his behavior. That belief was based on years of observing how similar incidents were handled. Until we change the consequences, we will continue to have these problems." The meeting lasted 3 hours. Maria presented statistics, case studies, and detailed analyses of how other states had successfully addressed similar issues. She demonstrated that her proposal was not just idealistic reform but a practical solution based on proven approaches from other jurisdictions. Hayes and the other officials were impressed despite themselves. They had expected to deal with an angry victim seeking personal satisfaction. Instead, they were confronting a reformer who had done her homework and was prepared to fight for systematic change. The scope of her vision transformed the conversation from damage control to genuine policy discussion. But implementing such changes would require political will, financial resources, and sustained effort from people who had been comfortable with the status quo. Maria understood that her proposal would face significant resistance from coaches, administrators, and community members who viewed her recommendations as overreactions to an isolated incident. This resistance was already becoming apparent in social media discussions and community meetings. Some people argued that sports were inherently emotional and that officials needed to accept a certain level of verbal aggression as part of the job. Others claimed that Hammond was being made an example because of political correctness rather than because his behavior was genuinely problematic. Maria had anticipated this pushback and was prepared for it. She had documented dozens of similar cases, interviewed officials who had left their positions due to abuse, and researched the long-term effects of tolerating aggressive behavior in youth sports. Her response to critics would be based on evidence rather than emotion. But her most powerful weapon was still her patience. While others demanded immediate resolutions, Maria was building something that would last long after the current controversy faded from public memory. She understood that real change required not just winning individual battles but transforming the entire battlefield. The true test of her strategy was about to begin. Hammond's criminal trial was scheduled to start in 6 weeks, and his civil liability would be determined shortly thereafter. But Maria's larger battle for systematic reform was just getting started. She had spent a month in apparent silence while actually constructing the foundation for something that would demonstrate the real power of preparation, patience, and principled action. Her quiet period was ending, and what she had built in those weeks of seeming inactivity was about to reshape everything. By the 6th week after the assault, Maria Gonzalez had transformed from a victim into something far more formidable. Her home office had become a command center filled with correspondence, legal documents, policy analyses, and testimonials from officials across 3 states. What started as research into her own case had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of systemic abuse in high school athletics. The breakthrough came when Maria received a phone call from Rebecca Martinez, an official in California who had seen news coverage of the Central High incident. Rebecca had been struck by a hockey coach 2 years earlier, had received a small settlement, and had been required to sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevented her from discussing the assault publicly. "I'm calling because I can't stay quiet anymore," Rebecca told Maria during their first conversation. "When I saw what happened to you, when I saw how you were handling it differently than I did, I realized that my silence had been part of the problem. There are others like us, Maria. More than you might imagine." This call opened a door that Maria had not expected. Through Rebecca, she connected with a network of officials who had experienced various forms of abuse, intimidation, and assault. Most had handled their situations quietly, either accepting settlements with confidentiality clauses or simply leaving their officiating positions without seeking any form of justice. Each conversation revealed patterns that Maria documented meticulously. The abuse was not random or isolated. It followed predictable patterns based on the culture of individual programs, the leadership provided by administrators, and the consequences established for crossing behavioral boundaries. Coaches who faced minimal punishment for verbal abuse often escalated to more serious behavior. Programs that tolerated disrespect toward officials created environments where violence became more likely. Maria began organizing these conversations into a comprehensive database. She tracked incident types, outcomes, and long-term consequences for both victims and perpetrators. The data painted a disturbing picture of systematic tolerance for behavior that would be considered criminal in any other context. But her research also revealed something hopeful. In districts where clear policies were enforced consistently, where administrators supported officials rather than appeasing aggressive coaches, incidents of serious abuse were significantly less common. The problem was not inevitable or unsolvable. It was the result of choices made by people in positions of authority. Armed with this evidence, Maria began reaching out to state athletic associations, officials' organizations, and advocacy groups. Her approach was professional and data-driven. She did not present herself as a victim seeking sympathy but as a researcher proposing solutions to a documented problem. The response was mixed but revealing. Some organizations were genuinely interested in her findings and eager to implement reforms. Others were defensive, claiming that her data exaggerated the scope of the problem or that existing policies were adequate if properly enforced. A few dismissed her entirely, suggesting that officials who could not handle verbal abuse should find other activities. These varied responses taught Maria important lessons about institutional resistance to change. Organizations that had tolerated problematic behavior for years had developed cultures and procedures that protected that behavior. Challenging those systems required more than just presenting evidence. It required strategic pressure applied consistently over time. Meanwhile, Derek Hammond's situation continued to deteriorate. The criminal charges against him had been filed, and his attorney was trying to negotiate a plea agreement that would avoid jail time. But Hammond's real problems extended far beyond the legal system. His construction business was failing as clients continued to distance themselves from the negative publicity. His marriage was strained to the breaking point. His reputation in the community, which had taken decades to build, was destroyed. Hammond's supporters had initially rallied around him, claiming he was being unfairly persecuted for a momentary lapse in judgment. But, as more information emerged about his history of problematic behavior, that support began to erode. Parents who had defended him started asking questions about other incidents they had witnessed or heard about. Players who had respected him began sharing stories about his treatment of officials that they had previously accepted as normal competitive intensity. The most damaging revelation came when a former player, now in college, decided to speak publicly about Hammond's behavior during practices and games. Marcus Thompson had graduated 2 years earlier and was playing basketball at a Division II school. He had maintained loyalty to his former coach until he saw the video of the assault on Maria. "I watched that video and realized that Coach Hammond had been building up to something like this for years," Marcus told a reporter. "The way he talked about officials, the way he encouraged us to intimidate them, the way he made us believe that they were our enemies rather than neutral arbitrators. I thought it was just competitive fire, but now I see it was something uglier." Marcus described practices where Hammond would role-play arguments with officials, teaching players how to crowd referees and make them uncomfortable with their calls. He recalled games where Hammond instructed players to complain about every call, to make officials doubt themselves, and to create an atmosphere of hostility that might influence future decisions. This testimony was particularly damaging because it suggested that Hammond's assault on Maria was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of behavior that had been developing over years. It also implicated the broader culture of his program, raising questions about whether other coaches were using similar tactics. The revelation prompted the district to launch a comprehensive investigation into Hammond's entire coaching tenure. They interviewed former players, reviewed game footage, and examined complaints that had been filed over the years. The investigation revealed a troubling pattern of escalating aggression that had been tolerated because Hammond's teams won games. Maria followed these developments with keen interest, but she was more focused on her larger project. The attention on Hammond's case had created an opportunity to promote systematic reforms, and she was determined to capitalize on that opportunity while public interest remained high. She scheduled meetings with officials from multiple school districts, presenting her research and recommendations for policy changes. Her proposals were comprehensive but practical, designed to be implemented gradually over several years. The key elements included enhanced training for coaches on appropriate behavior, clear consequences for violations, support systems for officials who experienced abuse, and transparency in how incidents were investigated and resolved. The response to these presentations was encouraging. Several districts committed to reviewing their policies and implementing some of Maria's recommendations. The State Athletic Association agreed to form a committee to study the issue and propose statewide reforms. Officials' organizations began discussing ways to better support members who experienced problematic behavior from coaches or spectators. But Maria knew that initial enthusiasm would fade unless sustained pressure was maintained. Institutional change required ongoing advocacy, constant monitoring, and the willingness to challenge administrators who preferred the easier path of avoiding confrontation. To address this need, she began organizing the network of officials she had connected with into a formal advocacy organization. They called it the Athletic Officials Protection Alliance, and its mission was to promote safety, respect, and professionalism in scholastic sports. The organization would provide support to officials who experienced abuse, advocate for policy reforms, and monitor the implementation of new procedures. The formation of this organization marked a turning point in Maria's approach. She was no longer just seeking justice for her individual case. She was building an institutional response to a systematic problem. The alliance would continue working long after her personal legal matters were resolved, ensuring that the reforms she was proposing would be implemented and sustained over time. Meanwhile, her lawyer Patricia Santos was amazed by how Maria's case had evolved. "I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've never had a client who transformed their personal injury into a movement for social change," Santos told her. "Most people want to get their settlement and move on with their lives. You're using your case as a platform for something much larger." Maria smiled at the observation. "Patricia, getting a settlement from Derek Hammond won't change anything for the next official who faces an abusive coach. But creating systems that prevent such abuse and support victims when it does occur will protect thousands of officials for years to come. That seems like a better use of the attention this case has generated." The approach was requiring enormous effort from Maria. Her evenings and weekends were consumed with correspondence, research, and organizing activities. She was traveling to other states to study successful reform programs, testifying before legislative committees considering new policies, and speaking at conferences of athletic administrators. But the work was also deeply rewarding. She was connecting with people who shared her commitment to creating safer, more respectful environments for youth sports. She was seeing concrete changes implemented in response to her advocacy. Most importantly, she was transforming a traumatic personal experience into something that would benefit others who might face similar challenges. The impact extended beyond athletics. Maria's methodical approach to institutional reform was being studied by advocates in other areas who faced similar challenges. Her combination of personal experience, comprehensive research, and strategic patience provided a model for how individuals could create systematic change even when confronting powerful, entrenched interests. As the third month after the assault began, Maria was no longer the quiet referee who had been struck at a high school basketball game. She had become a recognized expert on athletic-related abuse, a sought-after speaker on institutional reform, and the leader of an organization that was reshaping policies across multiple states. But her most important work was still ahead of her. Hammond's criminal trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, and his civil liability would be determined shortly thereafter. These legal proceedings would provide the final test of whether her patient, comprehensive approach would achieve the justice and reform that more conventional responses had failed to deliver. The network she had built, the research she had conducted, and the reforms she had promoted were about to face their most significant challenge. Everything she had constructed during months of apparent silence was about to demonstrate its true power. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, camera crews, and supporters from both sides as Derek Hammond's criminal trial began on a cold Tuesday morning in March. 3 months had passed since the assault at Central High, and what had started as a simple case of assault had evolved into something that would reshape athletic programs across the state. Maria Gonzalez walked through the crowd with quiet dignity, flanked by her lawyer Patricia Santos and several members of the Athletic Officials Protection Alliance she had founded. She wore a simple dark suit and carried herself with the same composed demeanor that had impressed people throughout the long months of preparation for this moment. Hammond arrived separately, surrounded by his own legal team and a smaller group of supporters. He looked significantly different than he had on that night in the gymnasium. The confident coach who had dominated sidelines for 20 years appeared diminished, older, and clearly struggling with the weight of what his moment of violence had cost him. The courtroom was packed with observers who represented far more than just this single case. Officials from multiple school districts sat in the gallery, along with coaches, parents, and journalists who understood that the verdict would establish precedents affecting athletic programs throughout the region. Judge Margaret Foster, a veteran jurist known for her fairness and attention to detail, called the proceedings to order. She had reviewed all the evidence in advance and was well aware that this case had implications extending far beyond the typical assault prosecution. District Attorney Michael Chen presented the state's case with methodical precision. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Video footage from dozens of cell phones captured the assault from multiple angles. Audio recordings preserved Hammond's verbal abuse and threats. Testimony from witnesses provided context about the escalation that led to the violence. But Chen's presentation went deeper than just establishing Hammond's guilt for the assault. He used the trial as an opportunity to document the culture that had enabled such behavior. Through witness testimony and documentary evidence, he painted a picture of systematic tolerance for abusive behavior that had culminated in violence. Former players testified about Hammond's pattern of encouraging disrespect toward officials. Parents described incidents they had witnessed over the years where Hammond had become increasingly aggressive with referees. Other officials shared their own experiences with Hammond's behavior, establishing a pattern that made the assault appear inevitable rather than unexpected. The most powerful testimony came from Marcus Thompson, the former player who had first spoken publicly about Hammond's problematic coaching methods. Marcus described in detail how Hammond had systematically taught players to intimidate officials, to question every call, and to create hostile environments that might influence referees' decisions. Coach Hammond told us that officials were our enemies, Marcus testified. He said they were trying to steal games from us, and that we had to fight back by making them uncomfortable with their calls. He would role-play arguments during practice, showing us how to crowd referees and make them doubt themselves. At the time, I thought it was just competitive strategy. Now I realize it was teaching us to be bullies. This testimony was particularly damaging because it suggested that Hammond's assault on Maria was not an isolated incident but the logical conclusion of years of increasingly aggressive behavior. It also raised questions about whether other coaches were using similar tactics and whether athletic programs were systematically undermining the authority of officials. Hammond's defense attorney, Robert Klein, attempted to portray the assault as an out-of-character moment of poor judgment by an otherwise exemplary coach and community member. Klein presented testimony about Hammond's charitable work, his success in helping players earn college scholarships, and his reputation as a dedicated family man. But this defense strategy backfired when prosecutors introduced evidence of Hammond's previous incidents with officials. Records showed multiple complaints filed over 3 years, warnings from district administrators, and at least 2 occasions where he had to be physically restrained during arguments with referees. The pattern contradicted Klein's claim that the assault was an isolated incident. The defense's problems deepened when Klein called Hammond to testify in his own defense. On the witness stand, Hammond appeared uncomfortable and defensive. When asked to explain his behavior on the night of the assault, he struggled to provide a coherent account that did not sound like he was making excuses for inexcusable behavior. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Chen systematically dismantled Hammond's attempts to minimize his actions. Using video evidence and witness testimony, Chen forced Hammond to acknowledge that his behavior had escalated over several years, that he had been warned repeatedly about his treatment of officials, and that he had struck Maria deliberately rather than accidentally. The most damaging moment came when Chen asked Hammond directly whether he believed his behavior that night was appropriate. Hammond's answer revealed the attitude that had enabled his increasingly aggressive behavior over the years. "Look, officiating in high school basketball is inconsistent," Hammond said. "These referees make mistakes that cost kids college scholarships and championships. Sometimes coaches have to stand up for their players and demand better officiating. Maybe I went too far that night, but Maria Gonzalez had been making terrible calls all season long." The courtroom fell silent as Hammond essentially blamed Maria for the assault. Chen allowed the statement to hang in the air for several seconds before asking his follow-up question. "Mr. Hammond, are you testifying that Ms. Gonzalez deserved to be struck because you disagreed with her officiating?" Hammond realized immediately that he had made a serious mistake, but his attempt to backtrack only made things worse. "That's not what I meant. I'm just saying that coaches get emotional when they see their players being treated unfairly. Sometimes emotions get the better of people." Chen pressed the point. "Mr. Hammond, you're a high school coach responsible for teaching young people how to handle emotions and resolve conflicts. Are you testifying that striking someone is an appropriate response when emotions get the better of people?" Hammond's inability to provide a satisfactory answer to this question effectively ended any hope for his defense. He had revealed the fundamental attitude that enabled abusive behavior, the belief that his emotional reactions justified his actions, and that victims bore some responsibility for the violence they experienced. When the prosecution rested its case, the evidence was overwhelming not just for Hammond's guilt but for the systematic nature of the problem he represented. The trial had exposed how tolerance for minor abusive behavior had enabled escalation to serious violence. It had documented the culture that treated officials as adversaries rather than neutral arbitrators. Most importantly, it had demonstrated the need for comprehensive reforms rather than simply punishing individual offenders. Maria's testimony was brief but powerful. She described the assault factually and without emotional elaboration. But, when asked about the broader implications of her experience, she spoke with the authority of someone who had done extensive research and built a comprehensive understanding of the systemic issues involved. This assault happened because Derek Hammond believed there would be no serious consequences for his behavior, Maria testified. That belief was based on years of observing how similar incidents were handled. "Until we change the consequences and create systems that support officials and hold coaches accountable, we will continue to have these problems." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. Hammond was convicted of assault, disorderly conduct, and intimidation of a sports official. Judge Foster scheduled sentencing for the following week, noting that she would consider not just the specific incident but the broader pattern of behavior that had led to it. But the criminal conviction was only part of the resolution Maria had been building toward. The real test of her comprehensive approach would come in the civil proceedings and the policy changes that were still being implemented across multiple jurisdictions. Hammond's conviction sent shockwaves through the coaching community. Some coaches expressed concern that the verdict would criminalize normal competitive emotions and make it impossible to advocate effectively for their players. Others recognized that the conviction represented necessary accountability for behavior that had been tolerated for too long. Athletic administrators found themselves forced to confront policies and procedures that had enabled problematic behavior. The trial had exposed how complaints about coaches were often ignored or minimized, how officials who reported abuse were sometimes discouraged from pursuing formal action, and how the focus on winning games had created tolerance for behavior that would be unacceptable in other contexts. media coverage of the trial reached far beyond the local community. Sports commentators debated the appropriate boundaries for coaching behavior. Legal experts analyzed the implications for how similar cases might be prosecuted in the future. Educators discussed what the case revealed about the culture of competitive youth sports. But Maria was focused on ensuring that the attention generated by the trial translated into lasting reforms. She used the media interest to promote the work of the Athletic Officials Protection Alliance, to advocate for specific policy changes, and to support other officials who were experiencing similar problems. The criminal conviction provided validation for her patient, comprehensive approach to seeking justice. But it also created opportunities and responsibilities that extended far beyond her personal situation. The network she had built, the research she had conducted, and the reforms she had promoted were now being tested on a much larger scale. As Hammond faced sentencing and the civil proceedings prepared to begin, Maria was already focused on the next phase of her work. The trial had exposed the systemic nature of the problem she was addressing. Now she had to demonstrate that the solutions she had proposed could be implemented effectively and would create lasting change. The guilty verdict was not the end of her story. It was the validation that would enable everything she had built during months of patient preparation to demonstrate its full power. The real test of her approach was about to begin, as institutional reforms would prove whether her vision of systematic change could be transformed from proposal to reality. 6 months after Derek Hammond struck Maria Gonzalez in front of 3,000 witnesses, she stood before a packed auditorium at the state capitol building, addressing a joint session of legislative committees considering comprehensive reforms to athletic programs throughout the state. The woman who had been seen as a victim of a coach's violent outburst was now recognized as the architect of the most significant changes to scholastic sports policies in a generation. The journey from that gymnasium floor to this legislative hearing represented a masterclass in how patience, preparation, and strategic thinking could transform personal trauma into systematic change. What Maria had built during those quiet months while others demanded immediate justice had proven far more powerful than any emotional response could have been. The numbers told the story of her success. 12 school districts had already implemented the core recommendations from her comprehensive reform proposal. The State Athletic Association had adopted new policies requiring enhanced training for coaches, establishing clear consequences for abusive behavior, and creating support systems for officials who experienced misconduct. 3 other states were studying her model for possible implementation in their own jurisdictions. But the most significant changes were cultural rather than procedural. The trial had exposed attitudes and practices that had been hidden or ignored for decades. Coaches throughout the state were reassessing their own behavior and questioning whether their competitive intensity had crossed lines they had not previously recognized. Athletic administrators were implementing oversight procedures that emphasized professionalism and respect rather than just winning games. Maria's testimony to the legislative committees was measured and comprehensive, reflecting the expertise she had developed through months of research and advocacy. She presented data on the frequency and types of abuse experienced by officials, documented the inadequacy of previous responses to such incidents, and outlined specific reforms that had proven effective in other jurisdictions. "The assault I experienced was not an isolated incident," she told the legislators. It was the predictable result of a culture that had gradually normalized disrespect and abuse toward officials. Preventing future incidents requires more than just punishing individual offenders. It requires changing the systems and attitudes that enable such behavior. The legislative response was overwhelmingly supportive. Representatives from both parties praised Maria's thorough analysis and professional approach to advocacy. Several noted that her recommendations represented common-sense reforms rather than radical changes to established practices. But the real measure of Maria's success was not found in legislative hearings or policy documents. It was visible in the gymnasium at Central High, where basketball games now proceeded with a level of professionalism and respect that had been absent for years. Coaches interacted with officials courteously, even when disagreeing with calls. Players focused on their performance rather than arguing with referees. Spectators cheered for their teams without turning sporting events into hostile confrontations. The transformation extended far beyond basketball. The reforms had been applied to all athletic programs in participating districts, creating consistency in expectations and consequences across different sports. Officials reported feeling more supported and respected in their roles. Coaches described relief at having clear guidelines for appropriate behavior rather than having to guess where boundaries might be drawn. Derek Hammond's fate provided a stark contrast to the positive changes occurring around the state. His criminal conviction had resulted in a sentence of 6 months in jail, 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and permanent prohibition from coaching at any level. The civil lawsuit had resulted in a substantial financial settlement that included funding for the Athletic Officials Protection Alliance and implementation of reform programs. But Hammond's personal losses extended far beyond legal consequences. His construction business had failed completely, unable to recover from the negative publicity and client defections. His marriage had ended in divorce, with his wife citing his inability to accept responsibility for his actions as an insurmountable obstacle to reconciliation. His children, now teenagers, struggled with the public shame associated with their father's behavior and the destruction of their family's reputation in the community. The comprehensive nature of these consequences sent a powerful message to other coaches and administrators. The tolerance that had previously existed for aggressive behavior toward officials had been replaced by clear understanding that such conduct would result in serious, lasting penalties that affected every aspect of a perpetrator's life. Maria observed these developments with satisfaction but without vindictiveness. She had never sought to destroy Hammond personally, but rather to create conditions that would prevent other officials from experiencing what she had endured. The severity of his consequences reflected the seriousness with which institutions and communities now regarded abusive behavior toward athletic officials. The Athletic Officials Protection Alliance had grown into a regional organization with chapters in 4 states and nearly 2,000 members. The alliance provided training programs for new officials, support services for those who experienced problematic behavior, and advocacy for continued policy reforms. It had become a permanent institutional voice ensuring that the changes Maria had initiated would be maintained and expanded over time. The organization's annual conference, held 1 year after the assault, drew officials, coaches, administrators, and legislators from across the country. Maria delivered the keynote address to an audience of nearly 500 people who had gathered to learn about the reforms that were transforming athletic programs throughout the region. 12 months ago, I was struck in front of 3,000 witnesses, she told the conference attendees. At the time, many people saw that moment as evidence of my powerlessness in the face of an aggressive coach. But that incident became the foundation for everything we have accomplished since then. She paused, looking out at an audience that included officials who had suffered similar abuse, coaches who had reformed their own behavior, and administrators who had implemented comprehensive policy changes in response to her advocacy. True power is not the ability to strike someone in a moment of anger, she continued. True power is the ability to transform that moment of violence into systematic changes that protect others from experiencing similar abuse. True power is the patience to build solutions rather than simply seeking revenge. True power is the willingness to use personal trauma as a foundation for institutional reform. The standing ovation that followed her remarks reflected not just appreciation for her words but recognition of what she had accomplished. The woman who had been struck down in a gymnasium had risen to become a force for change that had reshaped athletic programs across multiple states. The reforms continued to expand and evolve. Other advocacy organizations began adopting Maria's model of combining personal experience with comprehensive research and systematic policy development. Universities started offering courses on sports administration that included case studies of her approach to institutional change. Legal experts cited her civil lawsuit as establishing important precedents for how similar cases should be handled. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of her success was found in the letters she received from officials throughout the region. Many described how the reforms had improved their working conditions and restored their enjoyment of officiating. Others thanked her for having the courage to transform her traumatic experience into something that benefited the entire officiating community. One letter particularly moved her. It came from a young woman who had started officiating high school basketball just as the reforms were being implemented. Because of what you did, the letter read, I began my officiating career in an environment of respect and professionalism. I may never experience the abuse that you and other officials endured for so many years. Your willingness to fight for systematic change gave me the opportunity to pursue something I love without fear of being treated with disrespect or violence. This letter captured the true measure of Maria's achievement. She had not just obtained justice for herself, though the criminal conviction and civil settlement had certainly provided that. She had not just punished Derek Hammond, though his comprehensive downfall had certainly demonstrated the consequences of abusive behavior. She had transformed the entire environment in which officials worked, creating conditions that would protect future generations from the problems she had experienced. As the second anniversary of the assault approached, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her from that gymnasium floor to her current role as a nationally recognized advocate for athletic reform. The patient, comprehensive approach that had puzzled so many people during the months after the incident had proven far more effective than immediate emotional responses could have been. The 3,000 witnesses who had watched Derek Hammond strike her had seen what appeared to be a moment of powerlessness. But Maria's response to that moment had demonstrated a different kind of power entirely. The power to transform personal trauma into institutional change. The power to replace revenge with reform. The power to ensure that one moment of violence became the foundation for lasting protection of others who might face similar threats. Standing before the legislative committees, addressing the annual conference, reading letters from grateful officials, these moments revealed the true power that had been waiting within her apparent silence during those crucial first months after the assault. She had shown that sometimes the most powerful response to violence is not immediate retaliation but the patient construction of systems that ensure such violence cannot occur again. The gymnasium at Central High looked exactly the same as it had on that February night when Derek Hammond struck Maria Gonzalez. But everything else had changed. The culture, the policies, the expectations, the consequences all had been transformed by the systematic approach she had taken to seeking justice and creating reform. The woman who had been seen as powerless in that moment of assault had demonstrated the most profound kind of power possible, the ability to transform trauma into protection for others, to replace violence with justice, and to build lasting change from a moment of temporary defeat. The 3,000 witnesses had watched her be struck down. But they had also witnessed the beginning of something that would prove far more powerful than the violence that had seemed to defeat her. Her power had not been destroyed by Derek Hammond's assault. It had been waiting, growing, and preparing to demonstrate that some victories require patience, some justice demands comprehensive solutions, and some power reveals itself not in moments of violence but in the systematic creation of lasting change.